cafeteria. School resource officer, press 6. If you are unsure of your party's extension, remain on the line and someone will be with you.
With okay, all right, I think we're good now. So we'll go ahead and get started with roll. Can you all hear me okay on the computer? Awesome. Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. Ms. Suarez. Here. Ms. Parrish. Here. Mr. Anders.
Here.
Ms. Mormon.
Here.
Ms. Yoakum.
Here.
Ms. Dr. Johnson.
Here.
Ms. Alsop. Here. Ms. Franklin. Here. Ms. Rouse. Here. Mr. Turner.
Here.
Ms. Wolford.
Here.
Ms.
Yeah.
McMahon. Here. Howard. Here. Dr. Sharifian. Here. Dr. Foster-Steen.
Here.
Dr. Nelson.
Here.
Goldberger. Here. McCoy.
Give me 2 seconds. Let me
Ms. Creasy? Ms. Noonan?
Here.
Ms. Cook? And Ms. Word?
Hi, this is Gina Wolford. I just got on. I'm here.
Hey, Gina, thanks for joining us. I've got you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So good afternoon. We'll call our Early Childhood Advisory Committee meeting to order at 1:10 p.m. So excited to be here in person for this meeting, and great to see you all on the screen as well. You hopefully have received all of your documents via email. And so we'll go ahead and get started because we have a lot to talk about and discuss. And so I'll turn it over to Jenna.
Excellent. Thank you, Shaiki. It is incredible to be here and to be in person. I appreciate everybody for coming in, joining us. I see Cheryl is busy, and we know how even 2 years into this, incredibly challenging times are, and how time is one of our scarcest resources. So we deeply appreciate you joining us. I'm also really excited as we get into the meat of our work together, working on today on the guidelines for our quality measurement and improvement system, but lots of exciting work to come over the course of the next few years. So the good news and or the bad news is we have really one agenda item today, but it's pretty intense. We'll revisit, as we did with this group a year ago virtually, what we're trying to achieve with the new uniform measurement and improvement system that's now required by state law. We will go deep on some of what we've learned from doing it this year. So you remember there's 2 practice years. We're in the middle of practice year 2. And we want to continue to make sure that this work is shaped by the folks who are closest to children, closest to educators. So really sharing with you what we've learned from this year and making changes and updates, improving it based on what we've learned. And then we'll go through specifically the key changes that we will be taking to the board in April. You also received, and I see Cecilia's got hers here, it's a long document, but wanting to be very detailed about what this means for the field. I know we made additions last year when you said we needed stronger sections on improvement and other resources. So again, that accompanied that. And if there are at any point as we sort of move through the slides, if there are questions specifically about the document, we'll be sure to address those too. As a reminder, if we go to the next slide, Elia, there we go. One more, please. One more, sorry. The goal here, because it's been a while since we've kind of come together, is this isn't an item that we are seeking your endorsement for. So we will take this for first reading to the April Board of Education, and then we take it again in June for to go in effect after that. So we will be thinking today at the end, we will seek your endorsement, or if there's a set of things that you want us to change, what we'll do, if you'll remember we did this last year, was we seek your endorsement with X or Y recommendation, right? And that gives us time. We have just about a week, just under a week for us to make any adjustments that we need before it goes to the April board. So again, a lot of our most recent update items have been updates where we don't need an endorsement, but this is different because what I would like to be able to do when we go in front of the full board in April is to say we took it to the broadly representative Early Childhood Advisory Committee. And as you know, we're down a few board members right now, so making sure that this is, that we've had this broadly representative group look at these materials, including the guidelines, is really, really important as the remaining board members need to make a decision to go forward or not. So with that, we'll start first with the why, the purposes and the goals. I'll then walk through an update on practice year 1, then go through the enhancements, and it's really those enhancements and the final document that we're seeking your endorsement on. Folks on the phone, it's a lot of information today, and so I imagine that there might be some questions in the room, and I I go back and forth. I think it's probably best to, if, when we're in the slides, to ask the questions. Raise your hand or shout out if you're phone only, so that we know, if you've got a question. Or if you want to, I will also explicitly check at the end, and Becca can remind me to make sure for our phone folks, if it feels too awkward, you can hold your questions and we can go through them at the end as well.
And Aaliyah will also be monitoring the chat, so if you have a question, you wanna put it in the chat, we can make sure to interject those periodically.
I also should say this, I'm Jenna Conway. I'm Deputy Superintendent of Early Childhood Care and Education for those that are live streaming today. So, one of the things that's really important to us as we build this system that there's transparency about these processes. So just as a reminder, this does live stream. I am incredibly blessed to lead our effort to unify and strengthen early childhood at the Virginia Department of Education. A lot of changes in recent years, but we are now 8 months into fully unified under the Board of Education and Department of Education, and just really exciting. I've got team members in the room and on the phone. We've got Chris Myers, who is our expert on all things BPB5. I've got Erin Carroll, our Executive Director of Early Childhood. I've got Tamala Richardson, who's our Director of Learning. I know all the people in real life, right? If you want to get autographs afterwards, let's do that. Tonda Jeffries, who's our Director of Head Start Collaboration. Jeff Williams on the phone, who heads up our Office of Child Care, Health and Safety. Obviously, you've met Aaliyah, who is your point on everything from parking to which floor to all the materials. And then Becca Ulrich, who leads our access and movement work. So we've got our all-star group here and available as well. And I will reserve the right to use a lifeline of Chris Myers as if needed, if there are questions that are too difficult for me. But we're very excited to present this information to you. We go to the next slide, please, Leah. It's like I'm out of practice with these meetings, right? So I'd be remiss if I didn't start off our conversation with what we're trying to achieve together. And I think we're at a really important inflection point. Well, I know, and I hear from Cheryl and Cecilia and Clark and others that we're still dealing with this pandemic. It hasn't gone away. We know that there are real things like staffing shortages and challenges. We know our kids are coming in with behavioral issues like we've never seen before. But we are, as we start to come out of this, really coming back to our true north, right? Which is how do all of us work together on the phone, the groups we represent in this room today, to make sure that every child in the Commonwealth has the opportunity to come to school ready. And we know that persistently, unfortunately, 4 out of 10 kids in the Commonwealth don't have that opportunity to come to school ready. We think about access, and I know we've worked together, we've shared information with you, we've talked about what we're going to take to the board or to the General Assembly. We have to make sure that more families have choice and can choose an option that works for their family. We have all of the array of programs represented here. We also know we need to focus on quality. And that's really the core of our subject today, but thinking about how we build a system that no matter what option parents choose, particularly for using public funds, that we know that it assures them a certain level of experience. And that experience is getting better over time in order to promote more positive child outcomes. We know, and we will always think about the dollars and cents here, and I know that was a guiding principle in our work a year ago about what is reasonable for programs. We know we have a diverse set of providers and there are different financial constraints, right, that affect our behavior. So really thinking about how we recognize, reward, and compensate programs. And ultimately, as we'll model today, constantly using data to be better. I think that's really important, shifting away from quality as a binary, yes or no, simply because you have a certain degree or you exist in a certain type of building, to say how can we as a system be better? How can each of us as leaders, each of our educators be a little bit better tomorrow than they are today? Next slide, please, Leah. This is the simplified version of all those words, right? That we're sort of tackling both access and quality. Today, we will mostly focus on quality, but you know that we continue to work with you as partners on the access issues and choice as well, right? We want more choices from the families, and we want more children to have the opportunity to come to school ready. Next slide. You've seen this slide before, but again, looking at how we use DQB5 for our state required uniform measurement and improvement system to make sure we all share a true north and have shared expectations about what quality looks like across our diverse array of programs. Thinking about how we at scale measure and strengthen the things that matter most, teacher-child interaction and use of curriculum. And all means all, we're getting closer to all means all, publicly funded birth to 5 programs, infants, toddlers, preschoolers, in schools, Head Start, community-based programs, faith-based programs, family day homes, and ultimately that we build a system that supports our educators. If we've learned anything over the last 2 years, is that our educators have extraordinarily difficult jobs. The system is about supporting everyone to be as effective as possible and a laser focus on supporting them so we can improve child outcomes. Slide, please. With that, talk a little bit about, you'll remember the 2 core components. So the good news is we've had a lot, and I'll talk a little bit more about this data later, but we've had a real positivity around the 2 elements that we have selected and are using at scale. We're focusing on interactions and using a nationally regarded tool, the classroom assessment scoring system, or the CLASS, to measure interactions across all of our classrooms. And we're thinking about curriculum, right? The resources that educators can use day in and day out to intentionally promote learning and development. We believe if we focus, measure, and support educators across the system to use these tools in a way that's coherent, right, that's building on each other, that we can drive more positive child outcomes. It also should be noted, and we talk a little bit about child outcomes, right, but we also realize that directly measuring time stakes to child outcomes at very young ages is completely inappropriate, right? We never want to have a system that standardized tests 2-year-olds and somehow you use that to measure programs. So instead, you focus on these 2 things that matter for improvement, are within the locus of control for our leaders and for our educators. We'll talk a little bit about kind of the cost factor and how we're making sure that it's not a pay-to-play system where you have to kind of pay a bunch of money to be quality, and that more than several hundred studies suggest that if you focus on these things and you get better at these things, you will see a positive return in terms of child outcomes and scoring outcomes. Next slide, please. You've seen this graphic before, but again, presenting this again is not like we're all going to go to this one place and be there and then quote unquote as a state of equality, but we're really thinking about continuous quality improvement. And this is really important when we think about the diversity, the background, the different kind of skills and experiences and competencies that our educators bring. Moving away from, again, there's a credential, this is the one thing you need to quote unquote equality, and really recognizing the assets of all of our educators, but also helping them understand how to get better. And making sure that every educator in our publicly funded programs is receiving feedback, and then there's a so what, right? How do we support them? Make sense of that feedback, to grow, to improve. We know this is more important now than ever when you think of some of our turnover rates, right? And we got to bring in what brought you to this employment. How do we bring you into this cycle and support you to understand where you're doing well and where you can improve? And if we can do this systematically across our 9,100 publicly funded classrooms, then we can drive better outcomes for students. Next slide, please. You know, we've got practice years, and so just a reminder here, initially the state legislation called for 1 practice year to kind of bring everybody on board, help them understand what was being measured and why, give them a dry run of what does it mean to have your classroom to observe, what does it mean to report on curriculum, what kind of information would be shared about your program. When the pandemic hit, we went back to the General Assembly and said, you know, some prescient, we didn't think this thing was going to be over in a few weeks. You guys remember back to March 2020, we're like, oh, let me just go to the grocery store and buy enough stuff for 2 weeks. I'm sure this thing done, right? That's what we all thought back then. We realized that would not be 2 weeks. I don't think we thought it would be 2 years, but, and so we asked for a second practice year. And so, which has been great, right? Because we've got a lot of sites participating, as I'm about to share, but we didn't get to everybody. And so this gives us another bite at the apple in terms of being able to spend all of the next 16 months getting everybody on board. So by the time this thing becomes real, you know, folks will have had the opportunity to practice. And then you see the 23-24 year, is the first year it's required. So the first time, just for point of reference, that actual profiles or ratings will come out will be in the fall of 2024. So a very long runway, recognizing that this can be a lot of change for some of our programs, particularly when we remember that only 1 in 6 programs of our childcare programs participating in BQ prior to the law being passed.
Can I interject with a quick question? So publicly shared fall of 2024, do we know yet how that will be shared and how specific will be data?
That is a great question. We will talk a little bit about an adjustment for the regulations, for the guidance this year. And starting to do that work with the field to talk about beyond the numerical rating, right, which we are all clear on, what does the profile look like? So hold that thought, we'll come back to that, but that is, we want to make sure we get very clear with the field in practice year 2, what that will actually look like.
Thank you.
All right, next slide, please. I will not read all the words on this slide, although I feel like this is now an eye test for me, but we do want to be really clear, this is publicly funded providers, right? So this goes back to our overarching theory of change here, that it's an option, right? Not everybody is required to do this if you're entirely private, but if you are taking public dollars to serve our kids and families that are furthest from opportunity, we want you to be part of the system. We need you to be part of the system, right? This helps us make sure that as we look at the expanse across the state, like how we get every last one of our programs that serve these kids and families onto the grid, getting them measured, making sure we can support them. This is the list of programs, but generally speaking, it is when you get public funds to provide care and education services out of the home. So it's not, for instance, for just food assistance, right? It's for the kind of actual provision of care and education. We will, and we're always hopeful that we've made efforts in the last year through our childcare stabilization grant, through things like Recognize B5. We would like for more programs to be willing to take the childcare subsidy. And so we're continuing thinking about that as well. But again, if you do not take any of these sources of funding, this is optional. And then I could talk for hours about this, but I will spare us all. Leah, to the next slide. The other piece, and we've got a new name, you'll notice a trend in our names, B5, 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 but we've talked a little bit in the past about our teacher incentive or educator recognition or educator incentive program. We now have a new name for it, Recognize B5, but we've been making systematic investment in our educators over the last few years and are really excited to have evidence that it works. So this is part and parcel with BQB5. We provide direct financial incentives to our educators who are not employed by school systems of at least $2,000 if you're at a publicly funded program and you work 30 hours or more a week directly with kids. We started this using some of those federal dollars a few years back, and then we're able to do, in partnership with EBA, randomized control trial, which showed that it cut turnover in half. And really, because that was so successful, we've sought to increase the number of educators who benefit as well as the amount. So now it's at least $2,000 simply for participating. You don't need an additional credential. You don't have to reach a certain performance level. We realize that just for recognizing our educators and trying to slow down the high rate of turnover is critically important if we ultimately want to get to quality improvement over time. We can make big investments and you'll see them later in quality improvement, but if 30% of your teachers are walking out the door, it's like burning that investment, right? So really thinking through how we literally put our money where our mouth is in terms of recognizing this need to support our educators. And this also ties back to, I mean, ultimately, we're also structurally thinking about how you provide better rates and address some of the access issues, right? Shifting from funding all of our programs based on the market and saying, how do we as a Board of Education set these health, safety, and learning expectations, so as we do with BQB5, and then fund programs to achieve them. We recognize in Virginia that teacher compensation, which correlates very closely with turnover, has to be one of the problems we solve if we want high quality no matter where you go in the Commonwealth. So there's more detail on that. We'll talk a little bit about some of the results there and the findings, but just wanted to make sure when I say Recognize B5, you know what I'm talking about. And there's a great report on this, that we've been able to use to share the story across the country.
Well, your report, money's still there.
So so you know, the Virginia biennial budget has you sort of operating in two-year chunks. So right now, our budget isn't finalized, but based on what came out of the House and Senate conference, right now it doubled the commitment to this program to $10 million in state funds for the next 2 years. And we have approval from the General Assembly to also put some of our COVID relief dollars. So we are very confident on our ability to commit to at least 2,000 to everybody. I will say it's growing rapidly. I just looked at some numbers this morning. But we will definitely be able to do it for the next 2 years. The child care block grant is allowable use, so we could tie together the state and federal, beyond that. For us, what we want to do is get to a place where there's the state isn't necessarily providing a direct incentive, but we would only do that once we know that the rates enable our leaders to be able to provide the compensation that helps.
Jenna, on the Recognize B5, with the funding of $2,000, is that mandated by federal guidelines? And my question is, I know there are teachers out there who want to make a difference in the lives of children and are participating in the class observation, but may be employed at centers that do not contract with subsidy. So those teachers right now get $0. Teachers who are in subsidized get 2,000. It seems like such a huge, you get 0 or you get 2,000. I don't want to, they're going to hunt me down if I say lower than 2,000, so I won't touch that. But can we do anything for teachers that just happen to be employed at a school? Again, does not contract with subsidy, but are making a difference in the lives of children every day, and we're ignoring it.
So part of what the Child Care and Development Block Grant does, it provides a ton of discretion to states. It does say to states, like, you need to make sure that there is maximum access, right? A part of how you do that, and by access, that means to the child care subsidy program, which makes child care affordable for families who otherwise couldn't afford it. Part of that is how we set rates, right? And we've got some work to do on that in Virginia. A part of it is how they measure your success is how many programs you have participating in the child care subsidy program. So it's not saying that those teachers aren't making a difference, but ultimately we have to use some of these block grant dollars to get as many programs as possible to participate in the child care subsidy program. I think similarly, this was a goal of the child care stabilization grants. So we did provide, again, it's not like these programs did or experienced more or less kind of challenges related to the pandemic, but because we're following that federal expectation of maximizing access, getting as many programs as possible to be willing to take the voucher, right, so that the voucher has the greatest value possible is the reason that we make those
Sort of a question. So I love giving a financial incentive, but I also love when our teachers that want more continuing education, they can have that access and ability. This to me is great, but then you're gonna, take away from that with the teacher who's gonna use the $2,000 because they're so invested in what they do professionally every day, going on to pay, their continuing education out of that $2,000. So is this program conceivably going to broaden a base of more kind of financial support for those teachers that really do want to go above and beyond as far as professional development and continuing education?
Absolutely. We know that some folks are using for that. I will say when we do the survey and we see the results, a lot more are just using it for basic day-to-day needs.
Yeah.
We have in the last 2 years, if not 3 years, funded every scholarship request that has come through. So we have dramatically, fairly quietly, because we want to be very careful. Remember, there was so much concern around this moving to the Department of Education that you require a bachelor's degree. So we've been very careful, but that's not a requirement. That's not a requirement of this. But any sort of individual who's otherwise eligible and has requested a scholarship, we've funded all of those in both our 4-year and 2-year institutions. And I think we remain committed to that. So one of the other things that we're using both the block grant and the COVID relief dollars for our scholarships to grow that, as well as to work in partnership with ECAC around pathfinders and helping folks navigate, because it's both trying to get people in it, covering the cost of the further education, and then we know we were losing some folks in terms of, you know, making it work with everything else that got going on. So that we will continue to do that, and I think we looked at how much that's grown, and so it's grown pretty significantly. We'll continue to fund those programs. It's good. It's good. All right, another new introduction that we did not have last year at this time is Ready Regions. And so what our Ready Regions are is there's a collaborative effort with the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation that we have, again, providing it signed into law, kind of codified in law this year, to put in place a structure to make sure we can get to every last classroom in the Commonwealth. So if you will take a couple of steps back, we used the federal grant, the preschool development grant, to begin to scale, right? It was volunteering, folks like Vivian and others who are our first brave volunteers for this. We then realized that we started to have kind of, you remember the map, the sort of Swiss cheese effect of some areas are very well covered, other communities are not covered. And so in partnership with the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation, developed this structure, this Ready Region structure that sort of divides the state into kind of more consistent regions, make sure that every last city and county and locality is included, and then we will shift from funding PDG community networks. We would no longer fund those as of June 30th of this year, but it will evolve into Ready Regions, right? And we will provide funding to each of our, there's an organization in each of these 9 Ready Regions. We're still working on one more central, but there will be an entity who will make sure that we are communicating with all programs, building relationships, working to coordinate enrollment and access and choice, and making sure we've got somebody that we can put in charge of observing every last classroom, right? And making sure we're getting all that data. So you might say, how in the world can we grow to 9,100 classrooms, like twice a year? And it will take this type of infrastructure. This represents roughly for year one about a $13 million investment in infrastructure, but really important when you think about how do we bring every last program on, and hopefully we convince more programs to take public dollars, like we're constantly growing in terms of the size of our region and the options for families. All right. That's the key overview. Let me take you through where we are with practice year one. Let me pause here and see any of our folks who are coming in virtually. Any questions or concerns? All right. We love to bring you data and insights. And again, you've heard me say this before, we never want to build these systems out of Richmond, right? What we want to do is kind of, we've piloted, we've scaled, right? We've shared kind of what we've learned along the way. We want to share with you now, before we think about some of the changes that we're proposing, what we've learned from this year. Many of you in the room are even more expert than me in this, as you're doing this directly, but this, pulling together the statewide data kind of creates this level kind of set of knowledge in terms of what we know, what we've learned, and then you'll see how that helped us shape what we're proposing to change. So really excited. We registered more than 1,400 sites to participate this year. So that's good and good progress. You'll see geographically, we've got good coverage of the state. We still have some gaps. So the red is where there's at least one program participating in practice year one. The gray, we don't yet have someone there. And you'll see we've got a diverse set of programs participating. We've got childcare centers, we've got public schools, we've got family day homes. Really important. You'll remember that when we say we're going to learn from practice year one, we have to make sure that the state is fully represented and all of our programs are represented. Next slide, please. We are really pleased to see that folks are generally satisfied with the QB5 so far. And again, this is tricky, right? That sometimes accountability systems are not our favorite things, generally speaking, across the education sector. But we've tried to work really closely with partners like you all, programs across the state, our local leaders, to help kind of understand the why and how this can benefit educators. And so if you look at these bars show kind of, you think between sort of 4 is satisfied, 5 is very satisfied. if folks are satisfied with their experience of using Linkly 5, that's the data system that captures all this information, using the class to measure what's happening in classrooms, folks getting feedback, right? We like to make sure that sort of the equal, it doesn't do me any good if somebody comes into my classroom and observes and I don't get that feedback. Learning about curriculum and then receiving support. And again, we are hearing directly from thousands of educators across the state to make sure that this works for them. This is not just kind of top down from Richmond. Another way to think about that, if that's the quantitative data, if we move to the next slide, Aaliyah, we also have heard qualitatively from our programs that they're positive about this. It's great to see teachers excited about new curriculum. My teachers appreciate the feedback, right? And that we're all talking about this in the same language. We talked a little bit about when our system was so fragmented, we had different expectations, right? I thought I was quality because of this reason. You thought you were quality because of that reason. And it became a little bit of a deterrent for us working together. And now we're for the proverbial rowing right in the same direction, speaking in the same language. And then I think folks are already seeing, particularly for our communities that have been doing this for a few years, wow, like I'm seeing improvement in my educators, right? It's just so exciting and seeing how that translates into the positive results from kids, for kids, excuse me. Next slide, please. 4,200 observations this fall. So that's a lot. That's a lot. There's a lot going on. I mean, this number is remarkable when you think of there should be like the animation that comes in, and then there was Delta, and then there was Omicron, and still 4,200 observations were completed, really thanks to the incredible work of localities across the state. This is huge, right? This is folks going into family childcare, going into childcare programs, faith-based programs, early Head Start, school-based, whether that's early childhood special education, BPI, or other classrooms, really making sure that we're observing what children are actually experiencing at this time where it's more important now than ever, and getting that feedback to our educators. So folks will always say, there's just no way you can observe every classroom. Why don't you use a sample system? And what I have heard in my decade of doing this work is that every teacher needs feedback and support, right? And a sample system might give you a numerically accurate indicator, but really doesn't help every last educator. And so we are excited that the field was able to do this extraordinary work last fall, even with the challenges around staffing and variance and everything else going on. So this does give us a lot of data as we continue to shape the work going forward.
How successful were the observations in Spanish?
That's a good question. Chris, do you know, Cecilia was asking how successful were the observations in Spanish? I know we talked a little bit about this last year about making sure in classrooms where not only speaking Spanish or English language learners that we have them. There are other languages, yes. Do we know kind of how successful they were?
For the most part, they tried to match observers. I don't think there were a huge number in the first practice year, and it did vary by area, so I don't have the exact numbers offhand, but they were able to pick up some and match observers. They're still working on a big need to get more observers in other languages as well.
Can I tell an experience that I had? I'm a director and a teacher too with 3-year-olds. Somebody came to observe me. Just was the pandemic was starting, so it was difficult. I understand. And the person that had come to observe me said that first I told her, my class is mainly Spanish. And she said, well, I don't speak Spanish, so we can do it anyway, so you need to speak English. I said, okay. It passed me because I was being teacher. And then also she requested to have the person, I put the computer on one corner and she said, no, the person needs to be following you because I need to hear what are you saying and what the kids are doing. I said, oh my gosh, now I will have somebody shadowing me. And it was difficult. Yeah. It was very difficult. So I would like to appeal that we need to look for more people that speak another languages, not all the languages if possible. I know it's difficult, but I think that it will reflect what is happening. Otherwise, it's difficult. I was puzzled. I was the teacher. No, I'm going to do this. I want And so I just like to know what we are going to ensure that we are going to make sure that.
No, I appreciate that, Susan. I mean, one, that is not the experience that we want folks to happen. I think about it in two ways. I mean, we've set out expectations and guidelines around the linguistic match, right? So that you can fully understand the communication, right? Because children learn in the context of relationships and language. It could be that even though that's the expectation set, that's not always what occurred. And so Chris and I can work to look at the data and look at places where it looks like we're not getting matched, and also think through if that doesn't occur, how we can hear about it so that we can work with our regions to address that, because it really needs to be, the observation needs to be useful to the educator, and it needs to be in the sort of the typical setting, right? So if you're mostly speaking Spanish with the children or some other language, like that is what's natural, and that is what we're trying to get a measure of.
And also it should be connected with the trainings that we are going to receive from teachers. Sometimes the information that comes to us, I speak Spanish, I can read English, I can understand, but sometimes it's easy for me to read in Spanish. So sometimes the links will come in Spanish, how to open will come in Spanish, the word will come in English, I mean. So people are confused how we are going to do this in Spanish if they are giving us all the directions. But it is something I don't know what you're studying for, monitoring that, or how we are going to make sure that it's population that doesn't speak fluent English.
Yeah.
They can receive all the training.
No, I think it's very important. I mean, one of the things we have been working on is, at least for any materials and resources that are coming from us, right, making sure that they're now coming in English and Spanish, trying to make sure that they come at the same time, although we're not always perfect about that. This is good feedback for us in terms of also thinking about our improvement partners as well as Teachstone, and making sure that all of the resources are available.
I'm thinking on how my people, the teachers that work on my center, and it's a little one, but we count the teachers. Sometimes we have tried to connect with Teachstone, and it's hard to do it because we have 2 hours of waiting to respond. And sometimes goes to English, and then the person goes, no, I cannot do this. I just don't know.
No, and I very much appreciate that feedback, and certainly, again, I think what we'll see this year and next year, right, there's making sure that we've got the right expectations and guidelines, but then also how do we catch and support the situations where those are not necessarily being followed. Excellent, thanks. All right. So we have our new Secretary of Education, Amy Guerra, who's joining us. Do you want to say a few words, or you want to just have me keep going? Okay, excellent.
I'm so sorry to be late.
No problem. All right, so this is really important, and again, noting that there's still work to be done, as we talked about, and kind of how well these observations are happening. But also wanted to share that the data we have about Virginia is broadly representative of the different ages of children we serve. And again, that's really important. One of the things that we heard when we were first talking about this, right, beyond some of the points that Cecilia made about like how we're making sure that we're observing folks' natural experiences in a way that makes sense for kids and educators. That some of these systems, because most of the kids we serve are pre-K, end up being skewed that way. This is still proportional, right? But wanted you to know that we have, many observations of infant classrooms and toddler classrooms. That data is being used to run the numbers, test the system. So we will make sure that it's not a system that kind of gives any kind of preference or weight to sort of pre-K, for instance, over infant and toddler. So again, really important that the observations and the data we use to shape the way in which we update the guidelines is broadly representative of the kids we served. Next slide, please.
Yeah, before we go to the next slide, we had a question from the chat. Are there tools such as publications or videos, etc., available that can be used to communicate the benefits of class to religious exempt schools and others? And who is responsible to be sure others are aware of this change?
That's a great question. So there are a ton of resources. I think we're constantly looking to kind of get better at that in terms of like how do you be short and succinct, less jargon, more readily available. That I know that Chris has helped us and put together a toolkit on, and we can certainly.
Hey, I'm listening to the ECAC thing too.
coming on. As well as still a few bugs in the system, all right? And the fact that we're still here, people, we're still get connected. And then I think we're continuing to work on that question, right? I mean, again, it goes back to Grace and Clark's point earlier around like what is the value proposition, right? If you are a privately funded program, a faith-based program, if you are faith-based, you can take subsidy, right? So while there are prohibitions on state dollars, the federal dollars can be used in faith-based programs. And somebody who's had her own kid in faith-based programs that take subsidy, it could be really kind of a powerful way to bring those programs in. And so we are continuing to do that outreach there and make sure that there's more resources available on our website.
Teach them.
And Teachstone is a great resource, that is right, Clark. They have those sort of fancier graphics than we do, and kind of all versions from the very, very long research compendium to the kind of one pager or two pager. So another question we get asked, and Cecilia pointed out a way in which we still need to improve here, we can look at linguistic capacity. But if you're gonna do, right, we're talking about across 9,000 classrooms, we're talking about we as a state will need to get 18,000 classroom observations done each year. Deep breaths, big number, we're getting there. But you have to make sure you have enough certified observers. So I just wanted to present this data on how rapidly we've grown. And again, this is pre-K, infant, and toddler, making sure we're building the capacity across the state so that folks can do these observations. I also think, going back to our theory of change, you need a lot of people locally who are expert in what good looks like in order to think differently about hiring, coaching, supporting professional development. So this is an important indicator both for making sure we can actually achieve PQB5, get it done, support all programs, but also when you think about improvement, making sure we've got people across the state in the languages, in the ages you serve, is something we're monitoring as well. And we're very excited to see these results. Next slide, please. Similar to 64% are currently predicting. So you'll see this last point to note here, is that you'll see that sort of nearly 2/3 of these observers are conducting local observations. And some might say, well, are you concerned about the other third? Like, why are they doing that? We're actually good with that. I mean, really, when you think about having an ecosystem of a lot of people who have a shared understanding of what good looks down to specific behaviors and practices and characteristics, I'm fine, right? I'm fine if there's some center director out who's like, I don't want to do my observations, but I do want to know class in and out. So it helps me think about hiring differently, helps me think about coaching. I often talk about, for having had a child in a public pre-K program, having that elementary school principal trained to reliability in class completely changed the way that she saw that classroom. Previously, she had walked in and said, I'm looking for when I see my third grade classrooms. Why aren't the kids sitting at desks? Why aren't we doing whole group instruction? She did the class and she's like, I now know why we don't have kids sitting at desks for long periods of time and why we're not doing a lot of whole group instruction, right? So I don't think it's a bad thing that only sort of 2/3 of our observers are actually doing this observations. We'll continue to monitor that number, but having folks out there in the early childhood space, even if you're not doing the direct observations, but deeply understand class, will help support systemic improvement.
And do you have regard where there are deficiencies in the amount of observers that are actually in the field? I mean, is it more significant in the infant area? Is it in the toddler or pre-K? Where are the deficiencies? Where are the needs?
Yeah, so I think part of it, and we'll talk a little bit about kind of the ICP pilot in a second, I think part of it is certainly on the other languages, and we come across classrooms, right, that where children are interacting in other languages. Where we landed kind of a year ago when we're having kind of conversations about observers, we thought it was both important that folks, for instance, in special education classrooms had special education experience, folks who are observing classes that are working in different languages, right, have that kind of linguistic capacity. We've watched infant and toddler. I mean, normally we've got way more kind of pre-K capacity out there, but we're not seeing kind of any overarching sort of trends other than kind of the language and the background. What you do see is quite a bit of variation community by community. And again, building this database, right, being able to say, okay, who's doing this, like where might we need more, and tracking that is pretty important and putting that at the ready region's disposal. All right, next slide, please. This is a bit of an update. So again, one of the things we discussed as an advisory board or committee a year ago was how do we kind of continue to work with our TTACs, or the organizations that support our early childhood special education classrooms across the state, to look at what other factors that might be important. And so the jury is still out. We're still gathering data from practice year one here to kind of think about how we could potentially use a well-regarded tool, the Inclusive Classroom Profile ICP, with class and our inclusive classroom. So we have nearly 30 classrooms that have had both types, the ICP and the class observation. We're developing correlation documents, and we're getting feedback from those educators who've experienced both. I think right now, our inclination is that the ICP is probably less of a further differentiator or a substitute for class, but more as a really helpful tool to kind of round out the class, right? And to focus on some of the inclusive practices. So we'll continue to look at that data and bring it back to this group, but we wanted to know that we heard from you all last year the importance of piloting this, and we are out there doing that. And again, we'll bring the full data towards the end of the year as we think about, okay, do we want to require this across the board? Do we want to sort of fund it more to support it as a resource for these classrooms? I think similar to the points that Cecilia raised, making sure that in these settings that are unique, that we have observations that work well for educators and kids. All right, next data pieces. Curriculum. So class, one of the two main elements, 4,200 observations. We're not sharing data about that yet. It's a little too early because we still got the spring data, but we will share kind of overall how folks do later in the year. And we're building the capacity to make sure that we can observe every classroom and do it in a way that's accurate, consistent, and supportive to educators. Our second main element is curriculum. And as you know, we said we wanted to support programs to use the curriculum that was approved, and it was aligned with our early learning and development standards. So you've always said curriculum is a local choice. And so what we did was we this year launched a review process, whether it's a product you purchased as a system or as a center, whether it's something you developed on your own as a school division or as a center or set of centers. We were going to review it, check for alignment, make sure that it meets with some nationally research-based criteria. We have 32 approved curriculum right now, including 9 infant, toddler, and family day curriculum. So again, making sure there's a lot more pre-K options out there, making sure that we have multiple options in different settings and different age groups. We've heard from providers loud and clear, and I'll show this data in a second, that some folks don't have it and it remains out of reach in terms of affordability. And so we launched a low-cost open educational resource, which is a curriculum that will be posted online, as well as making some investment to support those programs that don't have and can't afford curriculum to use curriculum. And as you'll see, we got for the first time, right? Remember, we only had 1 in 6 programs participating in MBQ. So it's a huge question mark. Are people using curriculum? Are they not? We knew that our schools and Head Starts were mostly using curriculum. We had no idea about childcare in our family day homes. Now we do. We move to the next slide, please. So the good news is that 2/3 of the programs, if we think about the 1,400 sites or so that are currently part of Practice Year 1, are using an approved curriculum, one of those 30+ options across the Commonwealth. We know that 1/3 are not, right? And so that's kind of the most immediate, I think, needle you'll see moving through BQB5 is sort of understanding what is holding those programs back. Again, still an option, right? Remember, this is not a mandate. You just receive additional points if you're using an approved curriculum. But it's important to note that this sort of is a statewide average. We'll move to next slide, Aaliyah. That this looks very different across the programs, right? And this is why this data is so important. So across the board, nearly all of our public schools are using an approved curriculum, right? So nearly across the board, these programs have received the points. They have either submitted their materials they're currently using or they've shifted to an approved curriculum. The picture changes really dramatically when you look at our childcare centers and our family day homes. And as a reminder, our Head Starts are distributed across centers and schools, but all of our Head Starts are required by the program standards to use the approved curriculum. But 45% of our childcare centers are not using an approved curriculum, and 55% of our family day homes are not using an approved curriculum. Again, this is still a choice, right? But this data is what really drove us to say we have to get an option out there that's affordable, and we need to support these programs if they want to use that option, because otherwise curriculum can run you a few $1,000s per classroom, right? And that doesn't even include all the professional development and support that's needed. So how do we as a state recognize that there's some pretty significant disparities in who has access, right? And which kids in turn have access to curriculum, and how do we help resolve that? So Stream in 3, making sure that there is a Virginia option choice, it's an option that's available for programs, was a top priority. And I will say, we'll talk a little bit more about it, but Stream in 3 launched, I think, 10 days ago. The thing that sort of has us extremely excited and also a little nervous is that over 1,600 classrooms have signed up for Stream in 3 in less than 10 days. So the vast majority of them are in childcare programs. And I know we've got our team members, folks like Tamala, Cheryl, who'll be joining you. One of your Saturday meetings to kind of get the word out there, making sure folks understand that there's a pretty good choice. It's a choice, it's an option. You can still choose to purchase, or you can choose to say, I don't necessarily want these points. But making sure that there's something affordable for these programs is the top priority based on this data.
Jen, a quick question.
Yep.
I was shocked when I saw that data, the centers that are without. I guess I need to focus on the keyword approved. Is there data, like I would like to say if every licensed center uses a curriculum, do we have data? How many at least are using a curriculum? Maybe a curriculum that's not approved just yet. I will tell you the curriculum I use is not 1 year, and I plan to seek approval. I think it's an excellent curriculum. So I guess I have two questions. Is there data? Do we know how many centers just flat out are not using any curriculum? And then what is the approval process?
Certainly. Let me take it in two parts. So the challenge on answering the first question is that it gets very meta very quickly, because what people think of curriculum varies pretty widely. So I've experienced this now in 2 states where we've asked people to submit their materials, and what you using as curriculum might vary pretty significantly from people literally sending stuff that kind of comes from Google and Pinterest and craft activities, right? And they're like, this is my curriculum, right? You know, I've had experience in another state where we posted a sample of lesson plans on the website, and people will send that in. We ask this question, people will say, my curriculum is the early learning development standards. And so trying to actually get at like how many people are using nothing versus think they're using curriculum is part of the challenge there. So we are trying to, if folks have something that they like, you're trying to get those folks to, if provided it meets the kind of criteria, to submit that and review that. Like, we don't want you to have to switch if you've got something that works and it's aligned with the expectations, right? Like that's really important. The whole goal is switching curriculum is difficult. The more that we get into this work, we think that the programs that are signing up, for instance, having this high number of programs sign up so quickly, really indicates that they were using nothing, or what they were using together was really a cobbled set of instructional supports, but not a coherent curriculum. I will also say we continue to hear from educators that, and we know this is true even with K-12, that folks are kind of pulling it together, right? Like going online at nights, ad hoc, not necessarily kind of consistent across the programs, and that's more frequent than somebody who's like systematically using something across the board. You will remember we are treading very carefully here because we understand, right, that again, some programs come in with a little bit of an advantage here, and so the requirement for practice year 1, and which we will keep for practice year 2, is you only have to be using it in one classroom, right? This is not the best phrase to use this group, but this is baby steps to supporting widespread curriculum use in a coherent way across classrooms, because we don't think that's happening in actually a significant number of programs. I know it's hard to believe.
Well, I would just jump in, it's just my age, but back in the 12 world, when we first got SOLs, there was a lot of discovery about the fact that what people thought was curriculum was not curriculum, and K-12's moved very far in that, so I wasn't actually as shocked.
Next slide, please. talked a little bit about this as well, but wanted to give you a sense of the data around the growth of recognized B5 as well. So some of the challenges that Clark presented earlier, but we have significantly grown this program from just over 2,000 educators and about a $3 million investment in educators to this year we have over 6,500 educators signed up, and our current budget is about $12.5 million. So we're really significant state and federal investment in trying to slow down turnover. We continue to partner with BCF and UVA to measure this, right? To be able to specifically say, here's how we help make the difference. Not only because we want to stabilize this workforce, but because we believe it directly ties to kid outcomes. You're also building the system through Link B5 to be able to look at some of the variables we think of, well, what drives quality improvement? You think about things like class scores and use of curriculum. But we'll be able to look at turnover down to the classroom level and then look at kids' growth, right? And it could be that one of the big factors is turnover, right? And we have to really seriously get our system to tackle turnover if we want to produce more positive child outcomes and more growth within the course of a year. Yes.
So I think if we can look a little bit too at the definition of turnover, because I don't think folks leaving our profession to go do something else is one thing, but I think when a person leaves a particular childcare center because they're not satisfied and they still stay in our profession, to consider that turnover, that's not turnover. Like, everybody's not satisfied where they're at. And right now, I feel like there's a little bit of a punitive, now you're not going to receive what you said you were going to receive, going from place to place. So I think it's a little different when you're walking across the street for more education or whatever it might be. And so turnover is not just turnover.
No, it's a really important point, Angela. So part of it is not all turnover is bad, right? We can acknowledge that there are individuals who are not necessarily a good fit, right? And we've got some data on that in terms of, yes, if you're not a good fit for working with kids, and that shows up in those class scores, like, it's fine. You're okay for you to find and pursue another profession. I will say, you know, and they have this debate with, you know, K-12. K-12 turnover is like 5%. And you'll remember that our turnover pre-pandemic was like 23%, right? So that's an enormous gulf, right? And so, like, there's probably some right level natural turnover that occurs, and recognizing that some of it might be people pursuing greater opportunity, right, for themselves or for their families, and we know that happens. Two kind of thoughts to Angel's really important point. So one is, you know, we are seeing from our survey results that the majority of teachers are completely leaving the field. And we've been watching that really closely, and our partnership with UVA and having recognized B5 is giving us extraordinary new information about turnover, right? So that most folks are leaving it. And then we've really struggled, number two, is with the rules of the program. Because of the focus on stability for kids and positive child outcomes, we've made the decision, right, to keep it sort of to that same site. Hopefully, if that teacher does leave, right, that she'd be eligible the next year, and then if she finds a site that she likes, she stays for a longer period of time. But we do acknowledge that challenge around switching sites versus staying in the sector. But we looked at kind of the core rationale for this big investment. It really was about kind of kid stability. So I hear you, and I know that that's happening. And what we've tried to do in response to that is to make sure that this continues to be available year over year, so that if she does move, right, she's recognized, and then at the place where she feels better supported, can get additional training and support. That's a better one for her. Great question. Next slide, please. And this is just really powerful to some of the points made by Grace earlier about kind of impact of this. We have been stunned. There's an open-ended question on the survey results. We'd be more than willing to share that. We can remove names, but like, people will write in and say what a difference this program makes in their lives, right? Just mostly using it for essential needs. I mean, again, our folks make between $10 and $15 an hour. You know, some significant portion receive public benefits, and these dollars, you know, can and have made a huge difference in just being able to pay a healthcare bill or to be able to get their own kid into a service that they need. And really wanted to kind of note how important that is and how we have heard it changes your decision. I will stay for a few more months. Most of us who come to this work don't do it for the paycheck, right? Fairly obviously, and they would like to stay, but it's the paycheck that keeps them from doing it. So figuring out how we can improve experiences for kids, stabilize this workforce, make it work better for leaders, continues to be kind of an active challenge that we're tackling on B5.
Yeah, before you move from Recognize B5, looking at the data, is there a way where you all collect how 6,500 teachers out of how many? And the reason I'm asking is because we are doing a lot of expansion. And just to be able to see the growth in the number of teachers that are actually being retained, just in comparison to the overall number of teachers. And then I'm looking at the comments from the educators. They are they're great comments, but in our region, we have so I'm really surprised to see the great impact. The impact is good. We just don't see it a lot in our area. But it would be great to see like out of how many teachers are being retained.
Absolutely, and we can pull some. We're working with DB on that. We can pull that data and share it. I will say that there was the Recognize B5 pre-pandemic, and there's Recognize B5 in the current staffing thing. And I think of it less of like, wow, we're cutting turnover in half, and more around we are stemming what was is a tidal wave of departures. So I know that our same researchers who work on Recognize B5 have done some work in another state, and turnover there during the pandemic in childcare went over 40%, right? So I mean, you go from like whether it was nationally, which is around 25%, 20% pre-pandemic, to doubling to 40%, and that's half your teachers leaving, right? Which or teachers leaving every 6 months, which I think is, you know, for some areas of the state, particularly depending on other folks' economic options, like that, it probably is reaching those levels. So, you know, we've realized that this has been probably a Band-Aid more than a turnover kind of reducer in the last year and a half. And, you know, again, that is, we recognize that continues to be such an enormous challenge for our providers. We'll share that data on how the is in the ground. Very quickly, just to remind, and Chris has led this effort, but really throughout this year, getting out there, when sort of in addition to doing the survey, right, which gives you a broad set of qualitative data, making sure that we're going to the field, 35 presentations, 400 responses on the survey, multiple webinars, kind of going sort of to weekly office hours with the field, but really trying to make sure that we bring these changes to you, that they're broadly representative of the field. We'll go to the next slide. This highlights both what people have liked and we want to keep about BQB5, and then we're talking about some of the changes that we included in the materials that we sent to you. What folks had some questions concerned about. One, you know, was, you know, for instance, at the end, we keep hearing across the board, in addition to some of the staffing challenges, as you see at the bottom there, Shaki, right, which is, you know, also very stressed educators, and by direct tie some of the behaviors that are presented in our classrooms. And like, we're hearing this from high school, secondary teachers, we're hearing this from middle school teachers, we're hearing this from elementary school teachers, we're hearing this from kindergarten teachers, and we're hearing it from early childhood teachers. Some very real challenges out there. As we'll talk in a second, some of the key themes that emerged here is we need more clarity on participation, who has to participate. We need more clarity about some of the class observations. So they give us a really good example of that, of requirements and protocols, more information about the curriculum options, helping to improve Link B5 to make it work better for programs, and again, looking at how we can support programs around these staffing challenges. So with that, I'm going to take a pause for a second, see if we've got questions in the chat or from the audience, and I'm going to walk us through what the changes are for year 2. Folks coming in remotely, any questions or concerns? All right, Leah, if you will take us through to key points about practice year 2. All right, so 2 overarching points that I want everybody to walk away with, because you're like, I just read 97 pages, Jenna, like what is the takeaway? And I'm not even gonna ask how many pages you actually read, right? I imagine like some of you were like up late last night. But the two key takeaways are, one is things are generally the same, right? Like if it's not broken, don't fix it, right? And so based on satisfaction, what we've heard throughout all of the engagement that Erin and Chris and Tamala and Tandwa and Beck and others have done, and we're hearing that generally folks agree these are things to measure, these are fair to measure across the board. We have concerns about kind of maybe how they are being measured kind of fairly and consistently statewide, but that those are the things that are best for kids and that the research continues to show have the closest and most direct correlation with children's growth and positive outcomes. The other big thing is we're just continuing to beat the drum on getting folks to participate, right? We really want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to practice. There are no consequences. We can't make you participate this upcoming year, but we just don't want to have, we have to send the stern letters in the summer, spring of 2023 and say, now you have to participate. We would like to do that in a way where everybody has known kind of what's measured, what's expected, and are part of the system. And so the big investment in Ready Regions, the goal there in doing that so early is to make sure that everybody is aware of their ability to participate. Next slide, please. This is the overall timeline. And again, we're getting folks, right, we're shifting away. This is an important reminder. Chris has done some incredible work in communicating this to the field. Before, our quality rating system was kind of like on a rolling basis, right? You called, you signed up, you did it. We're now moving to a more annualized process. This is very similar to kind of what it is for our K-12 programs, right? Each fall, we put out accreditation results that come from the prior year, right? So there's the same cycle year over year. We get everybody ready in the spring, right? We do fall observations, we do spring observations, we capture the information about the curriculum in the fall. We then share your data back with you to make sure that it looks right and correct and accurate. We crunch all the numbers, and then we share the results. We'll talk in a second about Clark's question from earlier about how we share the results. But you'll see a similar cycle, like trying to kind of get in place versus a rolling basis. That's important for a couple of reasons. Everybody has different calendars, right? Head Start, schools, private childcare, family childcare. It also helps us keep it apples to apples, right? In terms of kind of consistency, and it gives us enough time to make sure you get the data. We have time to get the observations done. You can demonstrate the growth, right? We can share it. So you'll see it kind of follow a cycle that's similar to the school quality profiles. Doesn't mean we're publishing anything next year, right? Still private, still practice, but you'll notice that we'll start to get more and more analyzed about that. Next slide, please. And one more, there we go. All right, practice year ratings. So again, we're keeping every sort of generally things the same here. You have your interaction points, which are for all of your classrooms, your fall and your spring observation results, 700 points total. And then you have your curriculum points, 100 points there. We're using an approved curriculum in at least one classroom. And again, the reason for the fairly conservative measure there is just recognizing the big lift and kind of the pretty significant difference on the ground in terms of who has access to curriculum now and who doesn't. We add up those points. And again, our initial data, we'll share more data on this on the spring, is that the vast majority of folks in practice year one will meet practice year expectations. Some will exceed those, and then we'll be able to understand who is in real need of support from the state. But this was a shift. If you'll remember a year ago, you all said some of the terminology we were using didn't really match up with what we were trying to achieve, and we've made those adjustments. I think the field feels pretty good about this is the right way to recognize our ratings. As we come out of the practice year, we'll obviously come back to this question next year and say, okay, how do we want to think about this scale? Do we want 3 levels? Do we want 4 levels? So obviously practice year expectations is not going to be a forever terminology, but we think it makes sense to keep it consistent for this year as we bring everybody on.
And Jenna, who will be administering those ratings? They'll come from the Ready Region?
No, so they will come from us. So the law says that the board must establish this. It's just similar to how we have for the school quality profiles. We will pull all the information from Review 5 and we'll work closely with our partners at the regions, right? Because they help us communicate, but ultimately it's an important state Department of Education responsibility. And that helps us make sure it's kind of consistent statewide as well.
Jenna, just kind of briefly, can you explain how the state is going to handle the needs support? And I know from a K-12 perspective, have an accreditation issue. You know, the state does very different things, you know, with the holistic school division versus one particular program or center. So that's a huge lift, and, you know, how specific or how kind of knee deep is the state gonna get in providing that support?
If you guys are asking all of the perfect questions, or maybe later. No, so what we are gonna say in one of the enhancements is prioritizing these programs for supports first. And so, again, we heard loud and clear from this group, too premature to think about kind of consequences, right? That we've got to first figure out what's happening in programs. But the shift this year is prioritizing these programs that need support for supports, right? We can't force individuals or programs to take it, but we want to make sure that they are the top priority. In a year where there might be more interest in taking advantage of these resources, making sure that they're not calling somebody and being told like, yes, you would be a great candidate for coaching, but you're gonna have to wait 3 months, right? We want to move them to the front of the line. All right. Based on the data presented, the survey results, the feedback we've received from our educators, from our PDG community networks, from you all, here are the set of 7 enhancements that are included in those revised guidelines. It's about participation, some clarity around class observations and how we make sure that they're consistent statewide, supports for curriculum and really being able to kind of close that gap. To Grace's point about how do we prioritize our programs for supports, particularly those who are in most need of support. To Clark's question about how we're going to share this information, right? Is it just going to be a spreadsheet that's great to everybody? Or are we going to actually think about a better way to share this information with our policymakers, with our families, right? With our practitioners, improving the Link B5 user experience, and ultimately, as we learned this year, we continue to have just these, extenuating circumstances. And right now, we don't have a good process where if somebody has an extenuating circumstance, they can come directly to the state to say, hey, you should look at this and make a determination. That's our appeal process. All right, next slide, please. So the key point here is, again, making sure, let me sort of work backwards from here. We don't want to get to the summer of 2023 and have programs say, I had no idea, right? And that's a risk, right? I mean, as busy as people are and as much as we feel like we've been talking about this, and so our focus this year is, even if we're bringing you on mid-year, but is to get everybody on board, create a level playing field or starting point, and make sure that folks are aware. So I think some of what I believe it was Bev asked, right, about how do we let our religious exam know about this, right? Making sure we are getting materials and FAQs out there, that we're doing sort of full recruitment, that we're making it statewide, right? So there's full ready regions, everybody can participate, and doing a lot of direct communication. We are getting each year, as you see in these slides, more and more information on who's participating and on who's not. Becca, our separate part of our job is sort of been in communication with all of the childcare programs through the stabilization grant, and we're realizing that we don't always have the right email address or the right phone number, and so trying to kind of get to every last publicly funded program and every last classroom so that every last educator can benefit. So a real priority this year as we get closer to when this thing becomes real, and really kind of specifying exactly who has to participate and who can choose to participate is really important. Next slide, please. Our second set of changes that you found in the document relates to consistent observations and supportive feedback. And so there's 2 things we're trying to solve for here. First of which is, when we look at the data, when we ask educators, did you get observed and did you get feedback? We still see a delta or a difference, right? So we have more observations than folks get feedback. And we need to make sure, if you get an observation, it's only useful to you if you get feedback, right? And so making sure that that's happening statewide. Secondly is, part of what we're doing to achieve scale is providing a lot of flexibility locally on who can do observations, right? It can be the child care director. It could be somebody from the school division. It could be the head of the school. That does increase the likelihood of bias in the scores. It does increase the likelihood of discrepancies across different areas of the state. And so we, as the state, need to make sure whatever community you're located, whatever age you're teaching, whatever language you're working in, that there's consistency to the class, right? Otherwise, folks don't have credibility in the system. And we also know from the national research on class, if you really want to see improvement in outcomes, it has to be done in accordance with fidelity, right? Like if your class goes from 3 to 7, but it's not a real 7, like you're not actually going to see any learning outcomes for those kids, right? So a big shift this year is we are making a significant investment in third-party observation. So we're running a competitive process right now. There will be a group that will do thousands of observations statewide in classrooms that are already observed by local observers. And that will allow us to start to use math to kind of look at the consistency of observations statewide. You know, you've heard it, I give this example all the time. We still have, even in these practice years, and there's no consequences now, we still have situations where folks roll in and give their educators 7s across the board. And again, we have extraordinary educators in Virginia, but the statistical likelihood of having 7s across the board is nearly 0. But that's a case where rather than saying we're just going to throw those scores out, what we really need to do is to understand what's actually happening in that classroom and support that observer to be more with fidelity to the tool. So this will be a big shift. Hopefully kind of COVID variants will stay low. We'll be able to get folks and video out there. We'll use a mix of in-person and video, but you will see thousands more observations. And what it means we'll bring back to this group is this data on where do we see variations between the local and the third-party observers, and what steps do we want to take to make sure that folks are consistent right across the state. That might be substituting scores, right? That might be having to sort of adjust scores, but realizing in order for it to be fair and consistent statewide, like we need to have this third party. It's a functional kind of audit or check on our local observers. So that'll be a big shift. No consequences again this year. Always we say in the guidelines is that we are going to bring that data and look at that data and figure out how we support our ready regions to really look at observers and support them if they are consistently not implementing classroom fidelity. One of the things that kind of comes up is most folks see this and they think about, oh, well, there's bias if you know the educator. That tends to be actually less of an issue than an observer who gets way off and does a lot of classrooms. So when you actually look at this data, trying to recognize where do we have observers who might not have a clear understanding of class. If they're doing a lot of class observations, that means that those educators are not getting accurate feedback. So really trying to use that data, bringing it back to you all, as we will likely a year from now have to make some pretty tough decisions on how do we want to make sure that there's enough consistency statewide. When all of these results come out, folks want to know that it's fair, right? What happens in Colonial Heights is consistent with what happens in Chesapeake, right? And that's kind of our role as the state there. That's gonna be a big shift.
Joe, where are these third-party observers coming from?
So that is currently under a request for proposal. So we basically put out a competitive bid to find who would be the most qualified, best price for the state, and then we'll select an entity that will do the statewide.
Okay, so the RFPs that have been submitted so far, is publicly available
Not yet, we're still in the process, but they will be, I think.
before the process is completed and the decision is made.
I don't know if we can do that. I don't think there's a procurement rules, but they will once the decisions are made, whatever is sort of typically made available for the RFP. We work very closely with that procurement department.
RFP announced and it was public.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't know who it'll be from, because that's a process that's currently underway, but we broadly advertised to the kind of higher ed, improvement partners, groups across the state. We need an organization that will do X number of observations across the state. We need to make sure that they're highly accurate, they use the tool of fidelity. We can share the RFP now, right, in terms of the actual, the kind of parameters or guidelines, that's publicly available. We're just still crunching the numbers to make that determination.
I mean, I just wondered who has applied to do that.
I think you have to submit I'm not sure if it's a full FOIA request or a request to confirm it, and I know they won't release that until we're done with negotiations.
Okay.
But that should be soon.
That should be very soon. We can follow up as soon as that is done, so that you can.
Is the length of the observation third party similar to kind of what we're seeing?
Absolutely. And that's part of what we put in the RFP. Like you have to be, if you become the true north of the system, right, the data point that we trust across the state, like you have to be incredibly accurate. So there's follow the class parameters very specifically. There's a whole section in there about kind of calibrations that all of your observers are observing consistently. So all of a kind of, and this is so cliche, but the best in class, but literally the gold standard, like this third party becomes the gold standard. Functionally, what it does is it serves as, like most states, Head Start use a sample system, right? So we will functionally have a sample of classrooms. The other advantage of this is it allows you kind of across the state to kind of, through this randomized sample, track success over time, right? Because you can actually look at these third-party scores for which you know are kind of gold standard and look at them. The other really important piece is they will go to every site, right? So this idea in the other practice years, we didn't necessarily go to all sites, but getting to every site, to every age group is really important so that we can make sure there's consistency statewide. And we'll let folks know as soon as the competitive process is done. We'll have a whole set of protocols around similar blackout dates, letting you know when these are coming, that kind of piece, making sure you get that feedback. So figuring out all of those. So again, there's a benefit there. And again, no stakes or consequences attached to that, but really getting folks together, comfortable with the idea of a third party coming in is important in practice years.
I just want to say that from a ground level, I think that's the best thing ever, because we've seen lots of folks in our community that we know. And I think the anxiety of my teachers was a little higher. And then in our spring, people were busy and couldn't, and it was a new, fresh eye, and I felt like our teachers were more relaxed, and didn't feel judged from this previous, I think I know.
Yeah.
And so it was really nice. And so I feel like in the spring it has just been better because the people that didn't know, they were inviting, and it was better. It was much better. And I was one that was like, we need people from our community. And I was like, no, we don't. So I am appreciating that it's coming from a source that doesn't know.
That's so interesting. I know. Well, I was thinking about that and also the story that Cindy told earlier, right? Around if there are places, right? I mean, a whole host of issues could come up around observation. Head Start has been doing this for more than a decade, right? And having somebody that serves again as this arbiter of truth is really important, right? If the observer who comes in, you have a horrific experience, feel like the person is rude, they don't speak the language of the kids, we then send the third party in and they show a different score, like we then have the ability to use that score in place, right? Which might be a more accurate indicator. I also think to Angela's point, like everybody, and I heard this from Clark, I heard this from, like everybody has a different perception coming out of this. And ultimately for this to work well, like people have to believe in the system, and that statewide credibility is really important, right? Because if you feel like this person knew me and then scored me higher or lower because of that, like we gotta slowly kind of make sure that does not become the pervasive sort of feeling about the system as well. All right, next slide, please. All right, I feel like this is like when you're like the auctioneer, and if you slightly touch your body, am I calling you? And charging $500. So the next kind of key change here, and we've talked a little bit about this, I gave this away in terms of the interest, but really making sure, I've been stuck in my head this slide of the enormous gap, right? And then with Clark's caveats sort of provided, right? I mean, what folks are using or not using, could vary. But really making sure that we get to a place where there's a more level playing field, and 90% of childcare, along with 90% of schools and Head Starts, have access and can use curriculum, right? It just feels like this enormous gap. And so a real focus in practice year 2 before things count to get curriculum, if people want it, right, with the choice that they want in everybody's hands is a top priority for us. So if you've got a curriculum, want to make sure we get it reviewed so you can get those 100 points and you're recognized for that. And if you don't, you want to make sure you're aware of the 30 plus options, as well as to support you if you want to choose it to be able to use Stream and Free. I think that's really important in terms of creating a more level playing field for all of our program types as we go into this first real year. An open source option, really important to note this. So we didn't just bid for Virginia Choice. When we put out the competitive process to select a curriculum, we said to all of the potential competitors, like, you have to be willing to put this thing online, right? Like anybody can access it. And I think that's really important. We will, for some of the reasons that Grace noted, we will directly pay for coaching and support for some of our programs who need it most, but anybody and their mother can go online and download this. And I think that's really important. We've been sort of pleasantly surprised by how many folks that are not actually programs who've come up to us in the last 10 days and say, I want to support others to use Stream and 3, right? And you know, often the proprietary resources, right, that are come from many of the vendors are incredibly good, but you can't access their PD unless you purchase it directly from them, right? And that's such a limiting factor when you think of some of the turnover. So we have said it is a requirement. This happens to be, Stream and 3 was developed in Virginia, tested and piloted with family childcare, schools, inclusive classrooms in Virginia. So it's a Virginia resource, but it is an open educational resource. And that's really important so that programs can either go through the traditional channel and sign up to get the coaching or support, or they can say, you know what, I don't need that, or that doesn't work with my schedule right now. I'm just going to download this, support my teachers to use it, and make it go. A ready region can decide it wants to support it, right? A higher ed institution can decide it wants to support it. This happens fairly commonly in K-12, and through this process, we realized there wasn't a national option, birth to 5, for an open educational resource. There's a few 4-year-old kind of tools, but nothing that's birth to 5. So we're really excited about this. And again, it's a choice, it's an option. There are more than 30, but making sure that something's affordable, available, with quite a bit of flexibility around implementation is a top priority for us to go forward. There's more details and dependencies about this, but let me pause. I know curriculum has been a lot of questions about that. Are there any questions about our support for curriculum? The measure is the same, right? Clark might have, how many classrooms? 6 classrooms?
At one building.
Yeah, so 6, he only has to use it in 1, right, in year 1, and we give him credit because we understand the lift. Over time, we'll probably come back to this group and raise the bar on the curriculum metric, but in our focus, when you think of 55% of family day homes, right, 45% of childcare, our focus is closing that gap first, and then kind of continuing to raise the bar as we think about the use, fidelity of use across the state.
So my understanding is, this Stream and 3 is a great curriculum. I looked at it and it's really good, but it's not self-educating curriculum. It needs a lot of hand-holding. And we're talking about family kids. You said 1,600 people signed up for it, which is really making me nervous because based on what I understand, it's not, the coaching is not the requirements or mandatory when they adopt the curriculum. Is that correct? So how would we be convinced that it's going to be a successful adopting 1,600? So what are the prediction for success with adopting something? It's not Frog Street, not like very detailed that every teacher at any level can adopt it.
Absolutely. No, and I think a part of it is I think this is going to be a multi-year process, right? And again, we'll continue to adjust the metric in UB5 as we raise the bar. Our big investment in UVA is to support the kind of more intensive support. So when I say that there's 1,600 classrooms signed up, that's about folks who are getting into the queue to receive the more intensive supports, right? And we have prioritized the funding for those programs that are participating in practice year 1 and don't currently have a curriculum. So that we will continue to fund that work directly, right? Because you're absolutely right that just picking this up for most programs, particularly if you think about what may have kept, kind of to Clark's point earlier, like how could programs not be using curriculum? There's probably a set of barriers, right, that we need to systematically work with them to address. While we're doing that with those prioritized programs, anybody else can download it and use it, right? So like for instance, school systems, which may be more well-resourced to kind of do that type of support, they can do it, right? And we allow them to do it, like you don't have to go through us. But absolutely for those programs, including many of the family childcare and childcare programs, we are providing a whole wraparound set of supports through EA to fund that. Great question, great point. You know, and I think this will be something we will continue to kind of come back, and this is a nice cue into number 4 here. Again, sort of figuring out what's the right measure for curriculum and how do we get to measuring that and supporting that over time is really important. For a lot of these places, having the box on the wall, Chris, who led a lot of this work with VQ, that's a part of it. It's necessary but not sufficient to actually driving outcomes, right? It's the day in, day out use, individualizing the curriculum, making sure that there's consistency across your classrooms, horizontal and vertical alignment. Those are the things. I think we just have to be realistic about how fast we can move with the field when you think about those bar charts about how many people are using nothing. The prioritizing, so Grace, your question earlier, making sure that we are prioritizing our programs who are participating in VQP5. We begin to use this data to sort of understand who is scoring lower and might be in need of support. And again, we are doing work with all of the improvement partners. So we work with CDR, with the Infant Toddler Support Network, we work with the Ready Regions, we work with higher education. We will kind of share all of this and this and making sure that folks understand what's available. They're using this data, and that we continue to prioritize our programs in need for these resources. We'll then probably pull off. We'll come back to you next year with, okay, once this thing becomes real, and if you're in the need support kind of category, what does that mean? And it will likely be some version of like, we need you to participate, right? You will, as you would say, you're portionally invited and will participate in some kind of improvement, but we're not there yet. Our goal right now is to make sure that it's a clear catalog, folks understand what may be available to them, and we are doing a good job with our improvement partners to be able to support programs. Excellent. To Clark's question, it was first question of the day and we buried it 2 hours in, but piloting a site level quality profile. So I love spreadsheets, I love numbers. However, I think realistically, if we can move to the next slide, please, we realize that that's not going to be a way that most families experience and can take in this information. I also don't think it's the best way to fully represent our incredible programs, right? I mean, one of my sort of favorite or least favorite things to do is you Google the name of a childcare center and often not their official site comes up, right? Some weird white pages or yellow pages or sort of Spanish looking thing kind of comes up. So we want to think about in this practice year 2, asking the very question that Clark asked at the beginning of the meeting, which is what will this actually look like, right? How will we present the rating and the scores? Do you present the kind of piece related to interactions, the piece related to curriculum? How do you make that understandable and not the jargon that we use? What other elements might we want to present, right? The address, the hours, right? Do you want to put other details on there? Do we want to share things like credentials, so the other things that are captured in LP5? We wanted to put in your head today, and we have inserted into the guidelines this idea of more of a profile than just a number, right? Again, a spreadsheet statewide doesn't really help if we're trying to sort of inform parent choice. So we're putting this concept of a site quality profile out there in the guideline. And then what we would want to do is work with the field this year to think about what that looks like, right? Part of it, is it a PDF per page, right? Or does it look more like our current SQP, our state sort of school quality profile website? Obviously, we don't use the same things for accreditation, so it'd be very, very different looking, but we ultimately, this will probably sit on a website somewhere, and really working with the field this year to understand the rating will be a part of that, but there might be other things that we want to include that would help represent programs well and better inform families, certainly more than a number between 100 and 800 well. So that's important work this year, and not an easy answer to the question, Clark, but I think really important that we work with this group, with the field. We will probably pull together some prototypes, right, for folks to look at. We'll look at, there's a couple of options, right? We've got the kind of current R&R sites, we've got examples in other states, we've got our school quality profiles, kind of look at what you've got great schools, right? There's a couple of options out there, and thinking through what makes most sense for Virginia, bringing that back to us to make a final decision on by next spring, so that for the practice year, and for the real year, rather, we go in, you say, okay, I have a sense of both how my rating will be generated and then what this will look like, in a year's time.
It does.
Okay, good. But again, nothing shared, even if we generate these for next year and you'd see them, Nothing is to be shared publicly into the fall. We wouldn't launch the website until the fall of 2024. Because we can say it's practice, but as I've learned, if it's practice, but it's out there and parents see it, it doesn't matter if it's practice on it. So our real commitment is to continue to work closely with the field. Nothing would go out publicly until there's plenty of runway and plenty of fairness in the fall of 2024.
Yeah, but my concern was just the general population typically is not gonna have an understanding of class.
No, absolutely
They're not gonna have an understanding of the scoring system. You and I know a 5 and a 6 in a model is great by class standards.
Yeah.
But when you tell a potential parent looking on the website, there's been children saying, "I got a 6." I'm jumping up and down like awesome.
I know.
And the person's like, no, let me look at the next one.
Yeah.
So there's that education piece that, getting the public to understand class.
Absolutely.
And I do that in tours, so
Yeah.
believe me, I've told you before, how much I love it. So any tour, they get a big piece of that from me. But the general public looking at our website, that communication piece is what I'm close watching.
No, I think that's really important. I think we also will continue to engage families, right? Because I think it's both the, how do we best represent our programs, but also really engage families, right? In terms of what are the resources that would be useful for them, right? And it might be great, you might score a 6 on this, but if your hours are, 10 to 2, that doesn't do any good, right? I mean, this is part of the reality in terms of what the choices are. I know how the decisions are, so I would choose 6. All right, improve the Link B5 user experience. Yes,
I've got a run tonight, like 3 o'clock. Can I just say bye to everyone?
yes.
I just want to say hello, bye. And say thanks for letting me sit on this. And I just want to say why I think this matters so much and why I really want to appreciate what you're doing. I'm sorry to interrupt. I can interrupt on the way in, I interrupt on the way out. This matters so much, and I just want to say 3 things that why this matters to me personally and also my local secretary. One is just this has been a huge part of my career. I started off my working career in education at the National Governors Association, and one of the most fulfilling and important things I did there was the launching of the Standards Assessment Accountability Movement in K-12. But the piece that gave me the most fulfillment and just ignited a spark in my own learning was leading a school readiness task force for governors and business leaders. And that work was so important. It was the beginning of how do we communicate and use data differently to make the case and to show the return on investment. That this doesn't feel like the right thing to do, but it is the right thing to do. And that leads me to my second point about why this matters. It's data, right? We now know we have every year better and more data, proving the fact of what you all know is that we will never meet our goals in ensuring that every Virginian is prepared for life, prepared for success in the economy, prepared for success in their communities, and prepared for success in being an active member of our democracy without the work that we're doing here being successful. We now know that more with the brain research, we know it in terms of the economic research, we know it in all the data that no matter how great our K-12 system is, it cannot make up if kids are starting behind before they enter school. So hugely important. The third reason this matters to me is just on a personal level, I was a consumer and a customer. Jenna knows this, that when I first had my baby, we used the family home care settings. And Mrs. Ballot is still a part of our life. We get Christmas cards and share that with her. And whenever we're going back to Fairfax, we made sure we went back to Mrs. Ballot because she was part of the family. It was hugely important in having that stability, having that quality care, and having someone that my daughters just adored. Made a huge difference in allowing our family, my husband to work, and for me also not to have guilt, as all parents do, but also just knowing that she was getting the love, care, and help that she needed. So I'm just gonna say from those 3 areas of data, personal experience as a mom, and also just knowing how important policy is to this. So I just want to say thank you, and I'm really glad that this falls into the Secretariat of Education, that I had a chance to work with you all. So thank you, Jenna, thanks so much for all your leadership.
And so important, I think one of the things that I've shared with the secretary for folks who are coming remotely too, it's really important that this secretary and this leadership understands the importance of the work. We've been through a lot of change, but directionally what we're building is so powerful and can affect millions of children, and giving every child that opportunity to come to school ready is an absolutely essential ingredient if we want kids to get to the 3rd grade level. We just know that now, and I'm so glad that our secretary and leadership are committed to that.
I'll say one more thing, I can talk all day, so I apologize, but, and I can listen even longer. But I also believe that what's happening right now in the sector of early childhood is also a model for the rest of our education system. Just think of the words that you all were talking about: high quality, find choices for families that one size can't fit all, and how to make sure that families have the information they need, they have quality options, quality information, quality funding, that we're ensuring that those that need it the most have the most, have that quality, and a focus on results. And so those are things that I'm hoping that you are already doing and ahead of the curve on, will also inspire our conversation in K-12 and higher ed. So I just want to say thank you for inspiring. I'm gonna stop interrupting, but I just want to get back.
No, you can take it anytime. Thank you, Superintendent. So to the point of data, and again, I've shared with the Secretary how excited I am about Link V5. It's probably one of the few systems being built in the country that goes down to the classroom level across, and I say classroom in quotes, right? Because we have our family home settings. And really being able to capture various sets of elements and to use data to best support you. I think also to build the case, which I know everybody in this room believes, this isn't babysitting, this is education, right? Really, regardless of the background credential or the setting which it's operating in. Data that pulling together through Link V5, whether it's kids' growth, whether it's interaction scores, use of curriculum, going back to Ryan's point about like kind of fidelity of use of curriculum, like all of this, like we will need to use data to figure out kind of how to solve the problems. And we're building Link V5 to be able to do that. That means we need a Link V5 that folks can use and is usable and is also continually getting better. We know that that's not always, the case, right? As we're sort of building this, what is the proverbial building the airplane as it takes off? And so really a set of enhancements each year to make Link V5 work better for individual providers, educators, the ready regions, right? We also, this is great that we have this data here at the state level and I can share it with you and Secretary Gadara can share it and the board can share it, but I want to see what's happening here, happening within every community, right? Within every region, right? So that family and child care educators can get together in Northern Virginia and sort of talk about their data, right? And use that to kind of improve their practice, right? That it's not just, again, happening in this narrow way, but is democratized and folks can have access to the information. So we've got to continue to strengthen Link V5 and build that capacity to do that statewide. So we'll have ready regions in the online data portal this fall. We'll make sure that the observation windows align with the expectation. We'll figure out multiple roles within a user account, so you don't have to log in multiple times. We're working on dashboards and upgrades so it's easier to navigate, to enter your data, and have a more positive experience with Link V5. We'll continue to support our hotline. We know between our Link V5 work and our child care grant stabilization, no question goes unanswered. Okay, we've got and we know that there's still challenges, right? We've got everybody from folks who can do this on their phone in 2.5 minutes to people who are like, wait, what? How do I log in again? And we are here to support everybody. And we really know that, again, the same adage we say about everybody can be a little bit better tomorrow. We know we've got to continue to improve Link V5 user experience. We also are looking to more closely integrate it with some of our VKRP and PALS information, so we can start to look at children's growth over time, a real focus on growth, right? Not just the static school readiness. It is our clear and simple true north that we want all kids to come in school ready, but as the secretary just noted, we also know that like each year really childhood matters, right? And I think oftentimes our Head Start colleagues take in some of the most sort of historically disadvantaged kids and families, and they might start furthest behind, right? And it might be more about growth within a 9-month or 12-month period than it's sort of fully getting every last one to school ready, right? And recognizing that as valuable is really important. Only after we have that data can we do that. So we're going to keep working on Link V5 and make that work better for everybody. Last major addition or enhancement is an appeal process. And again, this just enables us to handle the one-offs that we've kind of been formally handling now. But as we get a little bit more formal around kind of collecting data, making sure that we're fair and consistent statewide, we'll create an appeals process. And basically this could be a situation, I mean, it's could almost be like what Cecilia described earlier. I came in, I had an observer who acted in a way that didn't seem in accordance with the guidelines, right? And I have some concerns about it and I want to let the state know. This is a pretty extraordinary circumstance, highly extenuating, you need to let us know. Or I had a situation, right, where it wasn't a blackout period, but, my teacher had a death in the family and my assistant teacher, you know, came out with COVID, right? So we had 2 substitutes in the classroom and they've never been in the classroom before, right? And you came in and did the observation, but like, we didn't get to you in time to tell you that stuff was bananas today, right? These sort of extenuating circumstances, really unusual, kind of maybe it's a setup in terms of your school, your program, but creating a formal process where you can, in writing, request a review. We can sort of handle those, look at those in context, make sure we come up with procedures and policies to handle them consistently. So if this happens to you in year 1, and then happens again sort of 2 years down the road, that we're handling it consistently as a system. So a lot of this already is in place. We had sort of some version of this for VQ. We have it right now for our K-12 accreditation system. We just need to build the same so that, again, no matter where you go in the state, you can trust that these things are consistent, are fair, that we're kind of tracking over time. So you don't have tremendous variation year to year in how we're handling extenuating circumstances. And we know that if we've learned anything in the last 2 years, that there can always be extenuating circumstances. Excellent. With that, those are the 7 major enhancements. I want to walk through next steps and then I'm going to open it up for questions, whether it's about what I've presented or I know that some of you have your full guidelines and can answer it there. But we can go to our next step slide. Just the details, kind of where we go from here. As Angela was talking about, we're into observations, doing that. That's kind of happening. We will kind of work with our partners to prepare for practice year 2. Once we get board approval, we'll do broad communications. We'll continue to help folks understand what this is. To the question asked earlier about a religious exempt, make sure we're developing resources, and as Grace noted, make sure we're prioritizing those programs that meet it most. We'll launch practice year 2, those fall observations, and then we will do a little bit of a rinse and repeat, right? Which is again, gather the data from practice year 2, do the survey, go to the field, and come back to this group and say, all right, here's what we've learned. Here's what we're proposing for our first real year. In there as well, I think exploring what a site quality profile could look like, engaging you and your colleagues on that, so that by the time we come back a year from now to finalize this for the real year, we've got a sort of strong appeals process. We know how we're using the third party. We have an understanding of what these site quality profiles might look like. We've got many more programs participating, and we've got sort of stronger data infrastructure as well. And then this is just the kind of key detail for our programs that we'll share more broadly. With that, let me pause here and see questions, concerns. It can be about either what I presented, or if you have a specific question about the appendices or the document themselves, this is the time to ask those.
That's sort of an odd question, just thinking about, I know we might be opening a second center in the middle of the first review here. So just think about like what would happen with that, and I'm sure there'll be others that just open in the middle of the year, and will they be incorporated somehow?
No, that's a great question.
I don't expect the answer, but.
No. So part of it is when I was speaking earlier about the annualized system, like we will track that pretty rigorously for kind of apples to apples consistency. So like if you open a classroom over a certain point in time, it ultimately will be a part of it, but if we have incomplete information, like we won't be kind of including the official profile, right? And the same is true for even like classrooms that might have been mid-year. It's just 2 apples to oranges if we're trying to kind of, do places that just have a spring observation and not a fall observation. So each year you'll find us getting sort of tighter and tighter on the calendar. It's like you have to be registered to fully participate, and we figure out how to let you begin to kind of sample and test with new programs, but you won't kind of get a full profile in that case.
And are levels playing any role now? Like you're in level 3, but you're not in level 4 or 3 roles now?
So it's just for those on the photo kind of on the level 3 versus level 4, which we're slowly moving away from Virginia quality,
Right.
and this will be the full system. Chris has prepared with our Virginia quality partners a kind of a transition plan out of that. We'll freeze them so you don't have to worry about that anymore. And then we're going to shift entirely to this system. So it still stands right now, you go to the quality website, and it
Yeah.
still shows up, but we won't make any changes there next year.
So we don't worry anymore.
It was,
So the current level, as of close June 30th, the programs that are in Virginia Quality can continue to try to apply for a higher level if they want to. And then we'll take the levels this summer and we'll freeze them, which just basically means if you're a level 3 or you're a level 4, you'll stay at that level. We'll continue to post it, its valid level until the fall of 2024 when these new levels come out because they will become the state's level of quality. So yeah, you won't have to do anything for that level. It will stay valid for the Virginia quality piece. And that way you can kind of focus on practicing.
Hi, Teachers Fund had announced a new tool. So I want to know, and they are telling about measuring environment. So is this going to play any role now?
absolutely, thank you. So, partly, you have all the great questions today, so I just sit somewhere else next time. So there is, some of you may have seen announcements last week, 2 weeks ago, about some evolutions to class. So we're still learning about this. This is obviously hot off the presses, and want to work very closely with Teachstone as it stands right now, right? Because we have a very long runway and thousands of programs, we would only use kind of the current version of class next year. So that would be out there, that might be happening, but for all the kind of the current practice year 2 guidelines, all will use the regular class as we know it for next year. No, we're not, it would be too much to kind of add that with everything else going on.
I have not heard, is this coming out of Curve?
This out of Teachstone, yeah, they just announced it last week, it's just some iterations.
I have a kind of a clarification question on participation.
Yep.
So it's gonna be a center by center participation approach, not a system approach like we look at, talk about accreditation in some cases. Just making sure.
Yeah, so because I believe, right, that the participation in the childcare subsidy program is down to the set. A little bit different with Head Start, I mean, sort of functionally, but yes, like the idea is like we look at the criteria for eligibility is at the site level, so you could have a
Just
system.
wanna make sure of that.
Yeah, so you could have a system where many of the programs take dollars, and then Medicare might be an example of that, like some programs, sites are willing to take, and are registered to take subsidy, some might not be, and that would be at the site level. No, I love it, I don't have time, but you can ask questions, this is the time to ask.
Hiring new teachers, so we constantly need to be training them in interaction. So, Teachers Fund is expensive, yes. So how are you planning to help these people that wants to learn about workshops?
Yeah, so one of the things, and so the real question here is, how do we continue to support the field around interactions? I think, and Teachstone is a high quality professional development vendor, but like they are not the only one who can support folks around understanding what high quality interactions look like, and that's really important. So we will continue to we've got our appendices that talk about the section about improvement, really significant multi-million-dollar investments and improvement, right? And really trying to think through how much of that is provided through statewide contracts, right, with like our infant support network. We've made a big investment in mental health consultation with both infant support network with UVA, and we're actually just talking to them as we set the parameters for next year, Grace, of how to make sure that they're prioritizing programs that are furthest from opportunity. I was just talking with the school principal yesterday about what a huge assistance mental health consultation has been this year with some of the behaviors, the trauma and the gun violence going on in their particular community, and just been huge, right? And that is more useful than say Teachstone training, right? Because it's about this explicit set of behaviors and how to support your educators to both be responsive to that, to think about how they need to structure their day to help those kids who are experiencing trauma, and even how you bring in instruction, right? Because you can't pause everything. And so that's kind of a model that works best for that. So we will continue to make those big investments in coaching, professional development, and support. We know that some of those dollars are sort of red regions are supporting that in some capacity or others. We know that sort of our teacher prep programs are going to pay attention to what's being measured, how to support that. So I think that those are the things that need to come up. We're still trying to figure out how you best match programs to resources and making sure that that's known to people. And so when we think about some of the work of the Ready Regions Beyond being absolutely done, really helping people match that. One of the things that's also shifted over time is our investments in AEII, right? We went from sort of shifting and supporting PD everywhere to saying, how do we prioritize those programs that are scoring lower and need additional support? So we'll keep monitoring that, but it is important to note that there will be a wide array of options from multiple vendors next year as it relates both to interactions and to curriculum.
Can I say something about that? I think too that it's really important. We use ProCare in our system, and our teachers, because they're younger and younger, they are so good and savvy about taking videos in their classrooms that they're sending to parents and those types of things. So then it's my job as a director to watch those things to be able to say, oh, there you go, teacher sensitivity right there. And we can use them when we sit with our staff so that they understand that it's happening room to room and sort of build in a system that works for us, because everybody's system is not good and we're looking for money, and we know that the state can't do everything, but I just think that there should be some responsibility on us that when we see that good score, that we start trying to figure out how to get that to go from classroom to classroom on our own. Because, I mean, it's hard work, but I've now gotten to a point where I've drawn the line in the sand and people don't just come in and go right in the classroom. You have to shadow, and you need to be able to speak like that teacher who got that really high score in that before you're let loose. Because if not, people are always just gonna say, I'm not supported. Once we find those teachers, we're just using all of this great state money to pay them really well so that they stick around and then they become the oozing pictures of good stuff that just kind of dwindle down to everyone else. But yeah, I know, I'm always reaching out saying, what can you do? How can you help me? And I'm like, I better help myself. and just invest in those teachers.
Absolutely. No, and I think that's really important, right? I mean, go back to, why we're still happy if 63% of observers are doing observations, but that 40% is probably doing what she's doing, right? Which is still using that kind of experience. And so making sure we've got more individuals trained on class reliability, right? Thinking about kind of using video sort of in a savvy way. I will say, right, we're kind of constantly brainstorming on how do we better support family day homes, right? Because that is the place where you kind of have to use video. If not, you can't really observe yourself, right? And so, but I think that those, that's something I know we're focused on with Infantile Support Network and others, working with kind of some of the family childcare associations, right, to make sure that those folks, in particular, think about using video as a way to help folks understand. I do the same when I get the little tadpoles video, I'm like, that was good. Missed opportunity, right? You can't take the class well.
I think sometimes it's hard for older.
Yeah.
Like I'm lucky that I'm working with them. At my center we have like maybe 5 teachers that are my age. So we are not very expert with parents, and it's difficult. But we are trying to do our best and like have support from anything else.
The other thing we are figuring out too, right, is in this new world of some Zoom, some in person, like are there ways to make coaching a little bit easier, right? I mean, because I do think that it is, we've heard that folks are like, I'd like to do in coaching, but then it means I have to I barely can get my teachers to meet ratios right now, right? And so trying to think through, or if it's like a lot of travel, right? Like how do we think differently about getting people the individual data about their educators and kind of connecting them to resources? And I know that's something that's kind of coming up. How do we use video for certain audiences? How do we use Zoom differently, right? I'm a huge fan of parent-teacher conferences virtually. Not because I don't love it to drive all the way and do the 15 minutes, right? It's just, that's one that's like, just turns out to be better that way. But that's a really, really important point that we can't assume that there's a one size fits all. You have to be careful with technology.
And also want to say that in a non-care and centers that are open from 6:30 in the morning through 6 in the evening, it's not that easy because teachers are working all the time. We have an hour break that's not paid, and we have to take the time off just to breathe in and breathe out. So it's very little time for my staff to sit and do training. And now we are with the Office for Children, and that's great. We have a lot of subsidy kids, and we even very weird of close because then we won't get paid. So how we are going to get paid to the teacher? So that is very challenging for schools like mine. I don't know what the story of that.
No, I think it's a really important point that I want to get to. I think there's sort of two things that have really emerged that are not necessarily the most common things when you think about quality improvement. So one is turnover, right? And you see that that's sort of front and center to some of our quality improvement work. I think the second is planning time. And my guess is that Daryl gets a lot more planning time, right, in the school system than your educators. We've actually talked about. No. I won't name names. I'll get myself in trouble. So that's quick got it. But is we have, as we've thought about, and you know that we've a part of the effort that we're not talking about as much today is kind of access and choice and funding. And I know that one of the things we're talking about is not only kind of compensation is a really important component of the rate that we set, but also planning time, right? It's if you don't have any time for making sense of what part of the curriculum is supposed to teach today, or how to reflect on what didn't work yesterday, like it's really hard to. It is very.
Well, my question was, well, we'll say right now I have a student teacher, in my, and she is coming from her universities. They're trying to pilot a program to get, more pre-service educators into these younger grades, and looking at some of these, quality measures that we're putting in place. Like, my district, we use class. We have class coaches, and we also partner with Teachstone. I'm thinking of, how can we, as we're trying to norm and get child care centers and districts, up to speed with this, has there been any talk or any idea of kind of introducing this to students that are looking to go into early childhood, so they already have that sense of class training, they get that preparation before they hit the classroom, because I can tell you today, one of my biggest things with my student teacher who I left early today was kind of modeling interactions with the children. So I kind of sat down with her today to talk about class. These are some of the things, that we're looking for. These are the interactions that we're doing. And I think that would really be helpful, in terms of, getting, I can't speak for child care centers, but for school districts, that would be helpful in getting, teachers up to speed by getting those pre-service teachers that exposure and that experience, with these measures, so that when they come in these classrooms, it's not a case of, they're having to leave to go to professional development to be introduced. They already have a background in it, and they can start, with those teacher-child interactions.
Absolutely. No, I think it's a really, really important point. And when you think about, things go through the interactions, and then even some of the piece around like, curriculum alignment and again, knowing what those choices are, right? You don't need to be trained on the curriculum, but know kind of what a good curriculum looks like and how to think about implementation. I think we're hopeful that by, you think back to some of our earliest slides, by this consistent true north, right? This is how we measure quality, this is how we do it statewide, right? That by being really clear about that enables better partnership, right, with community colleges and with higher education. I know that's something that when we've gone and talked with some of the conferences and the groups, something we've tried to emphasize as important, right, and thinking through. And I know that some folks have said, oh, this is interesting, would we want to incorporate in class as part of our kind of core curriculum? And some might and some might not, but I think there's these benefits that come around, these sort of system-wide benefits that come up if we shift away from a whole bunch of different ways of measuring quality and not measuring quality kind of consistently across all of our classrooms that all of a sudden emerge. And I know that is a question that I've gotten, certainly something that we'd like to support. There was some call for funding this year in the governor's budget around kind of a grow your own, right? Sort of to work more intensively with colleges, including our HBCUs. We were a little disappointed that that didn't get make it out of the two chambers in terms of a budget, but I think I am hopeful that the conversations about preparation in addition to ongoing service and support will kind of only grow over time, and we'll be able to again look at, and one of the things that comes up in this data in P5, we can look at the teachers who are brand new and sort of how they look versus for teachers who've been there for 3 years, right? So there's really interesting data coming out of Louisiana now that they've had this for 5+ years. You can look at sort of new teachers, veteran teachers. You can look to the point around who's leaving. And in Louisiana, one of the really interesting pieces of data that came out after a couple of years and the system had begun to reorganize around itself as interactions being one of the most important things, that folks got better at hiring, right? And the preparation systems cued in. So they had the sort of simple way to describe this data is you have 3 groups. You have the teachers who stayed, the teachers who left, and the new teachers, right? Across the board, the teachers who stayed scored the highest in class. But what was really interesting, the teachers who were new coming in scored higher than the leavers, right? So both was to the point where like maybe some of these folks should be leaving, but also that.
But not at lunch.
Not at lunch. Like, I know you guys all dread like tomorrow at 4 o'clock,
Yeah.
you're like, Friday at 4 o'clock, who's gonna call me, right? It's gonna, or Monday morning, right, who knows? But that's, the system does get smarter, right? And so, across a variety of factors, all of a sudden, Louisiana had figured out whether it was how people were hiring, whether it was how community colleges and higher ed were supporting people to prepare, but we were putting teachers that were better prepared in those classrooms than they had been in prior years. So, and again, that only happens once you have like a clear, consistent measure and a ton of investment around observers and capacity everywhere. But that's a really important point. And we will continue to engage. And the other advantage, which will really occur after 2024, is once this data is sort of publicly available, like everybody can sort of own and work with the data too. And that's important as well, right? So that if I'm in, a lot of the times, like, a lot of the teachers might come out of, right, JMU or something, they're in the Harrisonburg area, and say, okay, where are our JMU pre-K teachers good and where are their sort of, opportunities for growth, right? And how do we as professors in this program start to make those shifts? And they might look different from what VCU sees for, our PS teachers, right? And so, again, having this apples to apples, sort of useful data, actionable data statewide, I think will help be able to partner and more effectively with higher ed and with our preparation programs.
Is there not an opportunity to more holistically look at those technological necessities of being a professional in the classroom from a birth to 12 scenario as far as kind of working with AgTel and Chev on how to massage that? That's something we deal with that all the time. And typically, as the technology rolls in, I just remember my first year teaching, we got computers, 2 computers in our big department room. And I remember one teacher said, I'm out, like, I'm not doing this. I'm not doing email, so I'm retiring at the end of this year. And those are the things that, particularly in an early childhood situation, like you said, when you're working 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., so you're depending on those teachers to spend their night personal time to teach themselves these things. And that takes a lot of ambition, right? And unfortunately, they're few and far between, no offense to anyone in here that's a millennial, they're few and far between that really want to go above and beyond. And so I fear for the profession in general because of that. So maybe there's some more things that we can work into teacher preparation programs. I came from an undergraduate program where we had an early childhood lab school on our campus, and it was amazing. But those types of opportunities, again, are few and far between, but how can we make them a requirement?
I'll tell you something that's happening in private childcare centers, something you might consider, and that is closing for teacher workdays. I'm starting in the fall, and schools do it. Private schools, private
You're gonna do it
centers.
too, look at that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and
But it's your story.
you give the parents plenty of notice. I've given them 6 months, but you give them plenty of notice. And line up your trainers and have your teachers come in. You gotta pay them.
Yeah.
Have your teachers come in and do your in-service training, but close your centers.
One day is, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
We are going to
Yeah.
start with one day.
That's what I'm.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Considering being on a registered apprenticeship sponsor program too, you can do a lot of things in training that you provide.
Well, I think what's really important too is that we have to remember that the first thing to go on our exhausted teachers is their hearing. So this year we had spring break. I don't want to train you. I want you to go home, I want you to love your baby, I want you to wash your clothes, I want you to do whatever you want to do. But they got a spring break, and that's why I'm here today, because I am the 4-year-old preschool teacher and the executive director. But I'm here today because they were like, go ahead, we can figure this out. But if you have a meeting, go ahead. Where normally I'd be that person in the room in the quiet corner trying to do this, but they had a chance to rest. I think it's important that our calendars say this is what our teachers need in order for you to have this outcome for your child, and just do it. It's kind of jumping, because it's not what
No,
we've
no,
ever
no, I
done.
mean, in some ways, what you guys are discussing is partly why you need a measurement improvement system, right? I mean, sort of symbolically and philosophically, we're saying that we're all educators, right? And we're getting into every classroom, again, across settings. And then I think this then shapes, right, if you think about leaders like the secretary was saying earlier, you say, all right, these are the health, safety, and learning expectations, right? And then in turn, we need to fund to meet them. And I think Virginia is on the precipice of having to think really differently, right? That's how we do it in K-12, and we benchmark based on actual costs, right? Not based on what parents can pay or based on some back of the envelope, let's maximize every hour calculation. So in some ways, part of why we present that slide that talks about the overall vision and mentions access and quality, right? With access, thinking about how we set these rates, how that, funding that enables the behavior, right? Funding enables, if you pay for people's planning time, if subsidy allows for a planning day, then you can do it. If you don't, right, the dollars, dictate the behavior, right? That's the kind of the way that it works. And so I think these are really important systems. And again, as we get this data, it will enable us to build the case for saying, look, right, and the same is true on here's somebody, right, you might have a couple of different characteristics. I got somebody with a BA who came out very well prepared from this place, and I have somebody who doesn't have a BA, right? But these are the things that I did or we did, and that my community did, or that the improvement provider did to support them to improve. And so I think these are exactly the conversations that hopefully we will continue to promote. And our main goal is to make sure that we get this out as broadly as possible next year, so that you can do this in a situation that has no consequences, right? As you're sorting this through, right, so that the observation is an experience, we can fix that right by the time this is real, but absolutely figuring out kind of some of these best practices. The other point I want to note is there's just not going to be a one-size-fits-all improvement resource, right? And as we get this individualized data, like you will find you have teachers who are knocking it out of the park on one thing and need support on another, right? And when you having looked at this data across multiple settings in multiple states, going down, the classroom is the greatest point of variation, right? And you'll realize even within your setting, right, Molly's Clark has another, like, wow, I have a couple people who are doing this really well, and this, others are doing this really well, right? And how I think about what she needs versus what he needs might look very different. And without that information, and I know probably our school participants have this, that we sometimes get this PD that's actually not useful to us, right? So there's not only like, do I have enough planning time, but do I also then have enough planning time to do the things that actually align with what I need or what my kids need, right? And so I know that's often something I hear is that sometimes teachers say, I sit in a lot of PD, but it's not maybe as relevant to me or to the kids that I'm teaching as it needs to be. And I hope that by, again, getting this very consistent true north, building the capacity, right, around interactions and curriculum, that will be able to support people to receive more individualized PD, because that's the difference. When you're sitting in, something that is not relevant, or you already know how to do that, or is for, another age band is just not useful, right? And I know that that's frustrating too. Other questions, these are incredibly good questions, and we could probably talk for hours, but if you don't have more questions, I will ask for either an endorsement or endorsement with changes from our group. Any questions in the chat or from our folks out there?
No more additional questions.
Can I ask just one thing? Yeah. Kind of resonating with the data piece. So we saw that there was that lack of curriculum. That's just gonna stick in my head. Yeah. Is there a way to determine those with a curriculum that is maybe an approved curriculum right now versus those without? How are they supporting from a professional development standpoint? Like, are the ones without, just, do those schools have no professional, those centers have no professional development whatsoever in any kind of way, shape, or form? And the ones with do? I mean, I just think that would be an interesting correlation.
Yeah, and ultimately what we're trying to build, Grace, right, is the system that would help capture it. Right now, we have a couple of indicators, but none of which really get down to the classroom level, right? And so we kind of get these exit scores. So we have, right, so each of the program, nerd out a little bit, each of the program has an hour requirement, right? There's an hour requirement for BPI, there's an hour requirement for Head Start, there's an hours requirement for licensing, right? So sort of ostensibly, everybody is required by the program. As we all know, there's a ton of variation in what reps are. I mean, not if you're actually getting all those hours, and probably more importantly, the sort of value of those hours, right? And again, we know from extensive research that adults don't learn and kind of whole groups didn't get training, and still the vast majority of our training is, right? Just because it's easier and it's cost effective, and we find it's easier to do that. And sometimes coaching, even the coaching, actually when done well, has much better results. So that's number one. Number two, we do have asked about PD in surveys, and that's helpful, although it's hard to kind of connect that directly to educators' performance, and it really runs the gambit, right? From the folks who get very aligned curriculum to there's some trends, and we do see for programs that allot for planning time, like you're more likely to get better, more effective PD, and we've looked at that. And then I think what we're continuing to grapple with is, how do we sort of start to track this as correlated with like use of curriculum and class scores in Olympiad 5, but it's really hard, right, to figure out what to ask. Is it just the hours, right? When you ask people if they're satisfied with PD, this is like the classic thing, right? Everybody's satisfied with PD, so trying to figure out, and what we are grappling with, is how do you think about what works most, and how do you kind of get folks to kind of gravitate towards that. But there was a really interesting piece that came out last week about a national study around do you send college students to lectures, or do you have them work on problem sets? And the students who go to the lectures feel like they learn more. The students who do the problem sets and they get support feel like they learn less. Who do you think does better on the actual final exam? The problem set, right? So it's just this like constant reminder that even though normally when you ask people like what they say is a good barometer of what they're experiencing, like we still have this real challenge, and for all the reasons you all named, right, time is your scarcest resource. So trying to figure out over the course, and the points made about curriculum, we have to not think of this as a 1-year thing. This is a 3 to 5 to 7 year, like how to really use curriculum well. That's going to take some time. How do you think about kind of as teachers come in and roll off? How do we do that? But the sort of not having a great answer to that question, Grace, what I would say is at least we're building the capacity to start to do that better, and to kind of begin to shift our multi-million-dollar investments into things that we think are going to be more effective, and the support. Everybody goes into this work, from our higher ed prep programs to our community colleges to those who do. People want to be. It's not like the person in front of those college kids lecturing them wants to be ineffective, right? So it's just figuring out how we can better use data and support, know about the science of learning to kind of help improve our educators. Some of which is pre-service, some of which is ongoing. That will be the biggest. Once you get this thing rolled out and you get the classrooms observed and that's happening, That's the real big challenge. How do you support improvement in an individualized way across 9,000 classrooms? Come on, who's going? No. With that, all right, if there are not additional questions, I'm gonna turn it back to our chair here, if she could get a motion to endorse or some version of that. All right,
And so we've heard the proposed guidelines and asked great questions, and hopefully we have the answers to our questions, or at least some direction into where we're going to get towards getting those answers or clarifications. Do we have a motion to approve the proposed guidelines for the practice?
That we enforce the guidelines that we were providing today.
Second.
Motion has been made and properly seconded. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Ayes have it, motion carried. Thank you, Jenna.
excellent. All right. Do we have any public comment or anything else, Becca, or if we're not, Michelle, there is public comment?
No, we did not receive.
Well, thanks you guys. This was great. These were incredible questions. I appreciate the time. Really exciting to have you all see the secretary and see this in action. So just an indicator of the support for those of you live streaming of the importance of early childhood, really carrying over in a bipartisan way, administration to administration. So I'm here relying on this group more than ever to shape this work, and I couldn't have asked for more than a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for all your support.
Yes, that is very evident. It's the team around me that does this. I just get to talk about it.